Today on All Things 80s, part 2 of the Q&A. Welcome back to All Things 80s, and today I'm going to answer all the remaining questions I didn't get to in the first part. And if I do happen to have missed your question, I do apologize, but you can let me know and I will give you an answer. So without further ado, we're going to get straight into this. And the first one comes from Lego Batman 06, asking what's my favorite vintage Star Wars figure and vehicle and why? Well, for vehicle, it has to be the PDT-8, simply because it was my first ever Star Wars vehicle. And I remember quite fondly, I got this in Newcastle, England, because we were visiting my aunt and uncle who lived in Newcastle. And we went to the Phoenix department store. And I remember quite vividly getting the PDT-8. And for that reason, that's my favorite. And my favorite figure, I think, has to be the Luke Bespin, purely because aside from it looking like a really, really cool figure with the beige outfit, it came with two weapons, which was quite unique at the time. And for that reason, I think that's my favorite, although I may change from time to time. Okay. Next question is from 1980s and Star Wars guy, and that is one person. Question for 88. What was the one Star Wars figure you got so protective about and one you didn't really care about? Well, the one I didn't care about was the Death Star droid, and the reason being that I actually got that in a swap in primary school, and I don't remember what I swapped for it, but it wasn't a Star Wars figure. Might have been a Matchbox car, possibly. But the figure itself had those loose, flappy limbs, and the paint was rubbed off on the shoulders and the eyes. And for that reason, I really didn't care about it too much. The one I was most protective of was the A New Hope look, because it was so clean, so white, and I wanted to keep it that way. So that was the figure that I took the most care of, simply because I didn't want it to get dirty. So Rick Richards asks, hi Dean, my question is, what 80s bands still influence your musical tastes today? Quite simply, I would say Duran Duran, Iron Maiden, and Metallica. So now we have two questions basically asking the same thing. This comes from Paul and Sido, asking if I can do a room tour. The answer is yes, I will be doing that very shortly, so stay tuned for that. So now I've got two questions from a couple of cheeky lasses. Megan asks, who's your favourite niece? And then Rebecca goes on to ask, what's your favourite thing about Scotland? And I'm your favourite niece. Well, favourite thing about Scotland, family, duh. And in answer to the second part, who's your favourite niece? Well, my favourite niece is... So next up, two questions more or less the same from Alistair and Sith CJG69. Basically asking, what's your Grail piece that you have or want? And Alistair asked, if money was no object, is there any vintage toys you would really love to have in your collection? Well, my answer to that is not necessarily a toy, but one thing I really want is a vintage rally team burner BMX bike. I've yet to see one for sale that's in pristine condition, and I hate to think how much that would cost. But if money was no option, I want a rally team burner BMX bike, or a Skyway BMX bike, but really I want the rally team burner. So now the Batman has asked sort of three questions: top 5 80s movies, top 5 80s albums or bands, and top 10 80s figures. Well, I mentioned in the part 1 section that I'm not really huge on movies. It's something I'll need to give a bit more thought to give a more in-depth answer, but off the top of my head, obviously Star Wars. I actually misread your question regarding the 80s albums or bands. You've asked for top 5, but I've written down 10, so I'm going to give you the 10 anyway. And these are just bands that I listened to back in the 80s and still listen to today. So we have Duran Duran, Adam and the Ants, Iron Maiden, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, Motorhead, Bon Jovi, Wasp. I will give more thought to albums and do a separate video on that. And for the top 10 80s figures, rather than specify individual characters, some of the figure lines that I really did enjoy from the 80s, obviously Star Wars, Action Force, Mask, the A-Team figures from Galoob, $6 Million Man, loved those, especially the Maskatron figure. The Evil Knievel that came with the Stunt Cycle was a nice figure. Even though I never had any, I always admired Masters of the Universe, and of course Action Man himself. So this one comes from Joseph Productions, and he's asking, would you like to see Indiana Jones as a retro collection line? I have to say, not particularly, simply because I was never into the original Indiana Jones figures. I'm sure if you were someone who enjoyed them back in the 80s, you would absolutely love to see them come back as a retro collection. For me personally, if I wanted another line to become a retro collection, it would have to be Mask. So now Anthony has asked us, other than Kenner Star Wars, were there any other toy lines that you collected or still collect? In terms of what I collected then and want to collect now, Action Force, Mask, and Transformers. I have a very, very tiny assortment of those lines in my collection today. And once I get done recollecting Star Wars, I'm then going to focus on those lines. So now RDG SW Watt has asked me, how did you first connect to the Star Wars universe? Well, unlike a lot of people, my first exposure to Star Wars was in fact the Kenner figures and vehicles. In actual fact, I didn't actually see the movies in the correct sequence. I obviously saw Star Wars first, and that was on a VHS tape. And I'm guessing it was probably 80 or 81 even that was my first exposure to the movie side of things. So I saw Star Wars, then I saw Return of the Jedi in the theater, and then I saw The Empire Strikes Back on TV, I think it was. So for me, it was not about the movies, it was all about the toys. And what really got me into it was the fact that the first figure I got, which I cannot pinpoint whether it was Darth Vader or the Hoth Stormtrooper. My memory on that is just hazy. It was one of those two, don't remember which one, but it was the back of the card that got me hooked when I saw the other figures that you could collect. And so yeah, it was actually the toys that got me into Star Wars. So Road Pig John has asked me, do you collect G.I. Joe? And if so, show us what you have. Well, technically I did not collect G.I. Joe because in the UK we had Action Force, which came from the Action Man series of 12-inch dolls. And I believe Action Force was used as a means to introduce G.I. Joe to the UK and Europe. So I didn't have G.I. Joe per se, but I did have Action Force. And it is something that I will start collecting again. I have one Action Force figure at present, but once I get done with Star Wars, my attention will turn to Action Force. So now we have Lao Che asking, why is collecting small plastic representations of Star Wars movie characters so addicting? I think it's all just down to the nostalgia and the fact that when you hold these figures in your hand, it just transports you back in time to a really happy time in most of our lives. There's no question that looking back at childhood, it just conjures up so many great memories and feelings, and it's a nice escape from the hardships of modern adult life. So finally, Davey Militaria and Vintage Toy Show has asked, is there an easy way to identify Lily Ledy figures? That's something I really have no expertise on, but in the description of this video down here somewhere, I'm going to leave you a link that if you click on that, it will give you a lot more information about that. It's not something I'm at all experienced with, so I'm sorry I can't answer you directly, but check out down here somewhere and it should send you in the right direction. Okay, so that wraps up the Q&A. And as I said earlier, if I didn't answer your question, it's because I've lost it amongst all the papers I had to go through. But if you send me a message, I will answer the question for you. So I hope you enjoyed that. And as always, I want to say a big thank you to the Patreons who support this channel. It's absolutely fantastic, and your efforts are very much appreciated. And I ask you that if you did like this video, to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and stay tuned for more videos from All Things 80s.